Our current electoral system sucks and we need to fix it.
Okay.
All right, let's do this. A lot of people think that because the system has always been this way, it can never change. But our parliamentary system is the perfect system to have proportional representation. Proportional representation is when parties get seats equal to their vote share. You get 20% of the vote, you get 20% of the seats. You get 50% of the votes, you get 50% of the seats. From there, parties are supposed to work together to form a government that represents at least half of the population, if not more. But why is this important, and how exactly could this system work? Let's take a look. With roughly 40% of the popular vote, both Justin Trudeau and Doug Ford were able to get majority governments. And these governments had 100% of the power. That is quite literally minority rule. And if you're a dipper, don't get smug. Wab Kinew won 100% of the power with 45% of the vote. And in Ontario, Bob Rae won 100% of the power with 37% of the vote. Then there are the Greens, who can get up to 5% of the vote but end up with less than half of a percent of the seats. Governments all over the world work on a proportional system and have for decades. In fact, the countries in the world that score the highest on the democracy index all have proportional representation. Also, for the rest of the video, I'm calling proportional representation PR because it's a mouthful. Canada is actually the highest ranked country on the democracy index that uses first past the post. It's not that our democracy is in shambles, it's just that it could be so much better. And this isn't an unpopular opinion. According to a poll by Ecos, 68% of Canadians support PR. And that includes a majority of every single major party. It's also kind of funny that the Conservatives only have 54% support, when in the last two elections, they would have had the most amount of seats if we had a proportional representation system. And the countries that do have PR are also extremely satisfied with it. One of the biggest criticisms with our current electoral system, first past the post, is that it ends up prioritizing strategic voting so that your vote isn't wasted. This is because if your preferred party polls low in your riding, you might be incentivized to switch your vote to vote for a party you like less to avoid the party you like the least being elected. This ends up hurting small parties the most, like the Greens and the PPC, but can also have a notable impact on the NDP. As the two-horse race in many ridings tightens up, people want to make sure their votes count. And because your vote can be wasted if your chosen candidate doesn't win, it can lead to people tuning out of the electoral process. In 2019, 94% of people who voted for the Green Party ended up electing no one, meaning their candidate didn't win in their riding. Compare that to the 37% and 40% of Liberals and Conservatives. But even then, the fact that 40% of Conservatives who voted ended up electing no one isn't great. That's still massive voter disenfranchisement. Right now, in an attempt to make their votes matter, many citizens strategically vote, which is when you vote for the candidate in a riding who has the best chance of beating the candidate you do not want to win. You might be a card-carrying Liberal, but if you want the Conservatives to lose in a riding, you may vote NDP if they poll higher. Although typically this type of voting negatively affects the Greens and the NDP the most, with the Liberals picking up the strategic vote in many areas. And because there is only one party on the right of the political spectrum, vote splitting doesn't really occur there. Although later in the video, we are going to talk about what had previously happened when a legitimate right-wing populist challenger appeared. Spoiler alert, it resulted in the worst elements of the right wing taking over, having less choice for Canadians, and a more polarized political environment. And obviously, strategic voting is top of mind for many Canadians, as multiple strategic voting websites have popped up recently. One, smartvoting.ca, has gathered over 2 million unique visitors as of the filming of this video. And while many on the left claim that strategic voting is only supported by the Liberals, and many have criticized the creator of this site, that couldn't be further from the truth. JB is a staunch leftist who hasn't historically been friendly to the Liberals, especially when they stray to the right. But this is where we are in Canadian politics right now because of our electoral system. And there are ways to ensure that people's votes matter. In New Zealand, with their PR system, only 4.6% of voters elected no one, with that number actually being 51% in Canada in 2019. And in 2019, with less than 50% of the vote, the Liberals won 100% of the seats in Toronto, Peel, and Halton. Even comparing the Bloc to the Greens shows this disparity, with them getting almost the same vote share in 2019, but the Bloc getting 32 seats and the Greens only getting 3. Many people outside of Ontario and Quebec have issues with our elections that could be solved with PR. For example, in Alberta, some Conservative candidates secured up to 70% of the vote, but that still only represents 1 seat. Similarly, in many provincial and federal elections, some candidates win their riding with as little as 34% of the vote, less than half of what the highest percentage candidates win by. Another issue that those out west face is feeling as though the election is over before they even cast their ballot. Many elections can be won and lost in Ontario and Quebec, so even if somebody's chosen candidate wins out west, it doesn't change the outcome of the election. With PR, no matter what, your vote always matters. Well, almost always. One caveat that many PR systems has is a vote threshold. For parties to gain seats, they must hit a certain voting threshold, usually between 3 and 5%, in order to prevent fringe elements from getting elected. Let's take a look at this week's German federal election results as an example. Their conservative party, the CDU, won about 28% of the votes and 33% of the seats. Next up was the AfD, who is a far-right party, winning 21% of the vote and about 24% of the seats. While the AfD is concerning to many German citizens, all other parties have ruled out working with them, which prevents them from being able to form government. The remaining seats were divvied up across the rest of the parties who got more than 5% of the vote, including the Greens, 2 other left-wing parties, and another right-wing party. Lastly, 1 seat was allocated to a party that got only around 0.1% of the vote because the German courts acknowledged their need for representation as they are a party that typically represents a minority population. Although this isn't a staple of PR globally, I thought I'd mention it as it might be a good idea for Indigenous representation in Canada. 2 parties actually came close to the 5% threshold but missed it, with their Liberal Party getting 4.33% of the vote, bringing them from 91 seats to 0 seats, and their newly established far-left party getting 4.97% of the vote and no seats. While it really sucks that a party and its voters have no representation, having barely missed that threshold, the point of the threshold is to ensure that parties are generally viable and popular before they get political power in the system. With the results of the German election, the only way for conservatives to form government is to work with some of the center or center-left parties. And they've all made it extremely clear that they refuse to work with the far right. This creates a far more representative democracy, as the most likely coalition will be between the conservatives and the center-left party. This is going to represent a broad spectrum of views. The German system isn't exactly perfect, but it brings us closer to a more fair representation in government. And while some people do see the far-right AfD getting 20% of the seats as a concern, remember, in a 2-party system that first past the post creates, the alternative is that the far right takes over the Conservative Party, as we've seen happen with the Republicans in the US, as well as the Conservatives in Alberta. And not to mention the Saskatchewan Party in Saskatchewan. As Jason Kenney, the ousted leader of the United Conservatives of Alberta, said, "The lunatics are trying to take over the asylum." This is what he said in regards to the far right wing of the party trying to oust him and install Danielle Smith as the new premier. And I don't think I need to go over what is happening in the US right now. Even when parties try to be centrist or create a left-right unity government, like the original purpose of the Saskatchewan Party, eventually the worst aspects of those groups end up taking a hold and warping the party, as politicians who are desperate to not lose their seats continue to go along with whatever the fringe strong-arm them into. So what would that look like in Canada? One simulation by Fair Vote Canada would have had the Conservatives with 37% of the seats and the Liberals with 36%. In this scenario, the NDP would still be in the kingmaker position, but they'd have enough seats to choose to form a government with either the Liberals or the Conservatives. Or we can look at 2022 in Ontario as an example. In 2022, Ford got 41% of the vote, but 67% of the seats. The Liberals got 24% of the vote, but their seat share was 4 times lower than their vote share. In a PR system, Doug would have had to work with at least one other party to form government. Or opposition parties could have worked together to form government instead. In 2022, the party with the most amount of votes was actually did not vote, with 57% of the votes, or lack thereof. The really cool thing about countries with a PR system is that their voter turnout ends up being way higher because everybody knows that their votes matter. Because Canadian voter disenfranchisement is real. Let's take a look at some examples. In 1987, the New Brunswick Liberals won 60% of the vote. This resulted in, and this is not a joke, 100% of the seats. They literally had to assign their own party members as the official opposition. In 1996, in British Columbia, the Liberals won the popular vote with 42%, but the NDP won 52% of the seats and 100% of the power. This is called a false majority. Then in 2001, the BC Liberals won 57% of the vote and 97% of the seats. Then there were the federal elections in 1993 and 1997, which led to the current Conservative Party. Between the collapse of Brian Mulroney, after all of his scandals, including accepting cash bribes, and then the rise of the populist right-wing Reform Party led by Preston Manning, the Conservatives only got 16% of the vote and 2 seats. Meanwhile, the Reform Party got 19% of the vote and 52 seats. This created a pretty fractured parliament that didn't fully represent the will of voters. The same thing happened in 1997 when both the Reform and the Conservatives won about 19% of the vote, but the Reform got 60 seats and the Conservatives only got 20. After a third election in 2000 where both right-wing parties lost decisively to Jean Chrétien, the two conservative parties, who were inherently ideologically opposed, decide to join forces in order to try to win an election. 2 elections later, Harper won, and slowly the Conservative Party went from being two merged parties representing two different sides of conservatives in Canada to what they are today, which I would describe as a husk of their former selves, led by a sloganeering attack dog who doesn't really represent the will of the Conservatives from the Mulroney era. Instead, he seems to only represent the aggressive populism of the Reform Party. Electoral reform isn't about your party winning more seats or being more viable. It's about ensuring that all parties can stay true to themselves and that new parties can emerge to represent different ideological wings while still being viable. The creation of the reform made it impossible for conservatives in Canada to win. And the desperation to do so led to a party that leans into ideology and rhetoric that otherwise would be relegated to a far right-wing party. Meanwhile, the progressive conservatives of old might be more inclined to form a coalition government with the NDP or the Liberals, as we're seeing in Germany. And remember, both Harper and Trudeau won 100% of the power, majority governments, with less than 40% of the vote. Since 1950, only 2 majority governments in Canada won with more than 50% of the vote. Electoral reform isn't better or worse for the left or the right. It is simply better for everyone to have their voices heard and to encourage parties to work together for what is in the best interest of all Canadians. You're also going to see many Liberals and Conservatives support ranked ballot over PR. And I don't blame them for the appeal. Ranked ballot inherently just feels easier and less disruptive to implement. But by the nature of a ranked ballot, it still leads towards a more ingrained two-party system. Even if it allows for the creation of more smaller right-wing parties, the votes will all eventually coalesce into one of the two final camps. So what about the 2025 Ontario election? What would that look like under a PR system? The goal of electoral reform needs to be to create a more fair and representative democracy. And the best way to do that is through a PR system. And most of the criticisms of PR can be easily addressed. We can do PR and maintain local representation. We can do PR and prevent fringe or alt-right parties from controlling the government through minority rule. We can do PR and have stable governments. The expectation in most parliamentary democracies around the world is that parties work together for the common good. For too long in Canada, our parties have been at each other's throats.
And with the results of the 2025 election in, we can actually see what it would have looked like under PR. As it stands right now, Doug Ford's Conservatives won 81 seats, with the NDP winning 26 and the Liberals winning 14, with the Greens winning 2 and 1 independent person winning as well. But what would that have looked like under a PR system? Well, because of the way the vote share split, it would have actually been much different. You see, the Liberals got 30% of the vote, but they got less than half of that percentage of the seats. And while the Conservatives got 43% of the vote, they got 65% of the seats. So what would have happened if we had PR? The PCs would have had 53 seats, the NDP would have had 23 seats, the Liberals would have had 37 seats, the Green Party would have had 6 seats, the New Blue Party would have had 2 seats, and the Ontario Party would have had 1. Now I know those numbers don't exactly add up, and that's because I'm giving you a rough proportional representation number. And while smartvoting.ca had a very optimistic sense of what would have happened if we didn't have a vote split, I was only able to identify about 14 ridings where maybe it would have made a difference. Because it's really hard to make that assumption, but let's take a look. Some of the really close ridings that the Conservatives could have lost if there wasn't a vote split would have included Willowdale, Parry Sound Muskoka, where Matt Richter could have been the third ever Green Party of Ontario MPP, Peterborough Kawartha, Mississauga East Cooksville, which by the way was Bonnie Crombie's riding, so a vote split would have really helped her, Kitchener Conestoga, Hamilton Mountain, Hamilton East Stony Creek, and Cambridge. But there were some ridings that were insanely close. These include York Southweston, Scarborough Centre, Erin Mills, which as of recording only has a vote difference of 20 votes, Sault Ste. Marie, Humber River Black Creek, Burlington, Eglinton Lawrence, where the Conservatives only won by 0.4%. And lastly, there is currently a race in James Bay where the New Democrats are winning, but only by literally 4 votes. Before the election, I spoke to both the NDP and the Liberals. I told them that they didn't need to run candidates against each other and that their best chance of winning was working together. They told me that they could win.
Maybe it's time we start working together for once. If you like that video, please like and subscribe. Leave a comment down below. I got my Patreon in the bio. I also have a podcast called Perfectly Frank. I'll upload the videos here, and they're also on whatever podcast app that you use. Thank you so much, and I hope you enjoyed.
Okay.